right, so today we're talking about how did the Protestant Reformation change Europe. So the other day, or earlier in the video, we talked about how the Protestant Reformation occurred and what was the causes of it. Today we're going to talk about what was the impact of it on Europe itself. So prior to the Reformation, the church was really focused on money, was focused on getting people to respect them, and the church was not really functioning as a truly religious organization, I guess you could say. So the first question is, how did the Catholic Church try to reform itself? So the Catholic Church realized that there were some major issues going on within itself, which is the reason why Protestantism was able to spread. So the Catholics are going to try to fix some of the major problems that caused the Protestant Reformation. Something that's known as what we call either the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. Some historians call it the Catholic Reformation, some call it the Counter-Reformation, counter being that it was in response to the Protestant Reformation. So one of the things that was established to try to combat the spread of communism was something called the Jesuit Order, the Society of Jesus. It was founded in 1534 by a man named Ignatius of Loyola, who eventually becomes a saint. Now, basically, he had been a soldier fighting in Spain, and he gets injured, and while he's recovering, he reads the Bible. He kind of has a religious transformation himself, and he begins to found the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. Now, the concept behind the Jesuit order was this idea that they were going to defend and preserve Catholic teachings. They were going to emphasize education. So if you see it, a lot of Catholic universities are actually Jesuit universities, because the idea was, since many of the priests weren't educated well enough, they figured if they really gave a strong basis of education to the priests, this would help in combating the spread of Protestantism. The other idea was to send out missionaries into places like Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and almost then, I was talking about this in class, it almost becomes like a race who could convert the most people as the founding of the Americas occurs. Is it the Protestants or is it the Catholics? In addition, the Jesuits also focused on administering the sacraments to countries that did eventually become Protestant. So that was one way that they tried to kind of combat the spread of Protestantism. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, they were seen as the soldiers of Christ. Another was the reforms of Saint Teresa of Avila. She was a Carmelite nun. She reorganized and reformed convents and monasteries throughout Spain to emphasize helping the people. The other big thing that the church did was something called the Council of Trent. So the Council of Trent met on again and off again for roughly a span of 20 years. They decided to uphold traditional beliefs and practices. The power of the Pope still remained supreme. So they didn't give in to Martin Luther on any of Luther's ideas. But what they did do is they decided to work to end the abuses of the church. So things like nepotism and things like pluralism, things that were obviously church issues, church abuses, but were not necessarily things with church teachings, they got rid of. That was basically the main thing. And then finally, they set up something called the Index of Forbidden Books, a list of books that good Catholics are not allowed to read. Some books that criticize the Catholic Church or put the Catholic Church to a bad light, they set them up onto what was called the Index of Forbidden Books. So the second question is, how is the Inquisition a way to combat Protestantism? So now, if you remember, I mentioned this in class. I talked about how Inquisition means to inquire. So it was a board of, it was a church court whose job was to eliminate heresies, people who were going against the church. So it used torture, it used secret testimony and execution. So people could accuse you of being a heretic, you're brought before the Inquisition, and you'd basically be tortured until you confessed. Initially they targeted Jews and Muslims, particularly in Spain. But then they also began to focus on Protestants too. So if you lived in a Catholic country but you believed in some of the Protestant teachings, you could be focused on the Inquisition. Many Jews, like I said in class, had converted to Christianity, and they were referred to as conversos, and they were targeted during the Inquisition. The next question is, how did religious conflict lead to the witch hunts? So this phenomenon occurred between 1450 and 1700. About 12,000, mostly women, were executed. They were seen to have been possessed by Satan. And again, they used brutal techniques to get them to confess. They'd basically torture them until the women confessed. And this was in Germany. It was a peak between 1561 to 1670. It usually always targeted women. There was a couple of men that were convicted as witches, but it was mostly women. Usually older women who didn't have the protection of family to help them. They were usually the ones that were targeted. Only condemned to death if convicted of her own confession. But like I said before, they were exposed to all sorts of torture in order to gain confessions. And once they confessed, they were then sentenced to death. Another major impact of the Protestant Reformation is what's known as the Age of Religious Wars. So pretty much as Protestantism begins to spread and some people begin to become Protestant and some countries become Catholic, this leads to some pretty serious wars breaking out all across Europe. So this one here, this picture here is from the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre occurred in France. So King Charles IX of France, under the sway of his mother Catherine de' Medici, orders the assassination of Huguenot Protestant leaders in Paris. So Protestants in France were referred to as Huguenots. This led off to a massive killing of tens of thousands of Huguenots all across France. And about 20% of the French population was Huguenots. And so here you can see, this is a quote from the event. It says, "The streets and ways did resound with the noise of those that flocked to the slaughter and plunder, and the complaints and doleful outcries of dying men, and those that were nigh to danger were everywhere heard. The bodies of the slain were thrown down from the windows. The courts and chambers of houses were full of dead men. Their dead bodies rolled in dirt were dragged through the streets. Blood did flow in such abundance through the channels of the street that full streams of blood did run down into the river. The number of the slain men, women, even those that were great with child and children, was also innumerable." So we can see kind of the hatred and intolerance that comes as a result of this change in religion, which is why when we think about the Age of the Enlightenment, which was in the earlier video, we start to see a backlash against this, and that's why we start to see the rise of the ideas of religious toleration, because people really begin, after these years and years of fighting over religion, over kind of minute differences in religion, really people began to question, was this even right? Should we be attacking people on the basis of religion, or should we just basically learn to get along, basically? So we see here on this map, this shows us the areas that mostly became Protestant. And you'll notice that mostly Northern Europe stays Protestant, Southern Europe stays Catholic. Another major event that occurs during this time period was almost the 30 Years' War, which basically ripped Germany apart. If you remember, Germany, which was of course the center of the Protestant Reformation, because that's where Martin Luther was from, but Germany was, a bunch of different principalities, about 360 different regions. And so some of the German princes decided to become Protestant as a way to combat the power of the Holy Roman Emperor. So Germany was very divided amongst religion. And so this is going to lead to a war that's going to last for about 30 years, 30 years war hence. And also is going to lead to about the third of Germany's population dying. And it's also going to be one of the major reasons why Germany doesn't unite until the 1860s. It's going to keep it very, very decentralized. Another major religious conflict was, like I said, the Civil War that breaks out in France, the Civil War in Germany, which is the 30 Years' War, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in France, and then, of course, the Spanish Armada, when the Spanish decided to try to attack England. One of the major reasons why the Spanish were attacking England is because England, as we're going to see in a couple minutes, is going to become a center of the Protestant Reformation itself, and the Catholic Church is not going to be too happy about that, and they're going to try to force the English people back into the Catholic Church by, potentially the Spanish taking over England, which failed. So, I don't even have this as a question here, but how did each of the following change in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation? So the power of the Pope in some ways is going to begin to go down, but as a result, the power of the monarchies and the kings and queens is actually going to go up. In the Protestant Reformation, it was encouraged for you to read the Bible yourself, so education and literacy is going to go up. Unfortunately, especially in places like Spain, anti-Semitism is going to increase, and like I said before, intolerance is going to increase, and that's why we're going to see so many breakouts of violence between the different religious groups. And just to show you really quickly, Protestantism is an umbrella term. You have Christianity, you have Catholicism, then you have Protestantism, and then you have what we talked about earlier, the Eastern Orthodox Church. So within Protestantism, Protestantism is an umbrella term. There are many different types of Protestant groups. Here, I listed some of them here: Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Anglican, Quakerism, Pentecostal, Calvinist. They all have slightly different ideas. They're all considered Protestant basically because they're not Catholic and they're not Orthodox, and they grew out of this time period of protest and desire for reform of the Catholic Church. So let's talk really quickly about England and how England winds up becoming a Protestant nation. So the Protestant church in England is referred to as the Anglican Church. The reason why it's referred to as the Anglican Church is another term for the Church of England. So basically, Henry VIII of England, who was, for all intents and purposes, a devout Catholic, wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was from Spain. She was Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter. He wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she was having a hard time conceiving a boy. She had many children. They had one girl that lived to full, that actually grew up. And then she had many other pregnancies, but she had miscarriages, or they were stillborns, or they lived, but they died very soon after. So Henry wanted to divorce her in order to marry somebody else so that he could then have a son. So he winds up divorcing his wife, Catherine of Aragon, against the wishes of the church. He sets up something called the Act of Supremacy, which placed himself at the head of the church. So basically he said, in England, we are no longer Catholic. We are going to practice Protestantism. This means that I am now the head of the Church of England. And that's what the Act of Supremacy was passed for. In the end, he winds up divorcing his wife, Catherine of Aragon, marrying his girlfriend, Anne Boleyn. She also winds up giving birth to a daughter. So Catherine of Aragon gives birth. He has Mary, who eventually becomes Mary I of England with her. With his second wife, Anne, he winds up having Elizabeth, who winds up becoming Elizabeth I of England. He divorces, he has Anne executed. Their marriage kind of fell out of favor. He marries Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour gives birth to a son who is going to become Edward VI. So Jane Seymour's son is going to rule, Catherine of Aragon's daughter is going to rule, and Anne Boleyn's daughter is going to rule. After Jane Seymour, she dies in childbirth. He decides to make more connections with Protestant countries, marries Anne of Cleves. Their marriage ended very quickly in divorce for amicable reasons. He marries a very young Catherine Howard. Henry VIII is now very big and old. She winds up having an affair. He finds out about it. He has her beheaded. And then he winds up marrying Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr is stepmother to Elizabeth I and raises Elizabeth, and she winds up outliving him, basically. So he creates this whole mess, creates a whole new religion, basically, so he could marry his girlfriend. In the end, Edward VI is the only male child. He, of course, was sickly and dies in his early teens, and his sisters wind up succeeding him. So all of this changed for really not that big of a deal. So how was Calvinism different? So before I even start talking about Calvinism and Anglicanism, so basically the main thing to know about Anglicanism, or the Church of England, is that it's essentially Catholic without the Pope. Meaning everything pretty much stays in place that it was in the Catholic Church, except for now the head of the Church of England is the king, but everything else, the rituals, all the church hierarchy, it all stays the same, except for priests can marry in the Anglican Church. It's really the only difference, because his main motivation, again, was to divorce his wife, not necessarily because he believed in the ideas of the Protestant Church. But created a lot of upheaval in England, and England then, from then on, becomes known as a Protestant country. So the last question is, how is Calvinism different from Lutheranism and Anglicanism? So Calvinism was founded by John Calvin. He says here, we say that God foresees all things, even as he disposes of them. All things have been and eternally remain under God's observation. We call predestination the eternal decree of God by which he decided what to do with each man. For he does not create them all alike in condition, but ordains some to be eternal life and others to be eternal damnation. So the basic idea behind Calvinism is this idea of predestination. That God essentially has chosen who's going to heaven and who's going to hell when you get born. It's already predetermined. All humans sin and deserve only condemnation, but God has preordained at the beginning of time who it is that he will graciously save. So that means those people are referred to as the elect. he sets up in this movement of Calvinism starts in Switzerland. So he sets up a theocracy in Geneva, Geneva being a city in Switzerland, a theocracy being a government that is ruled by the church. If you practice the ideas of Calvinism, you follow very strictly the rules of the Bible, you live a very simple life. Calvinism, as it spreads to other places, changes names. So in France it's Huguenots, in England it's Puritans and Pilgrims, those people that founded Massachusetts Bay Colony, Connecticut, and those areas. And then in Scotland it's Presbyterians. They're all Calvinists. So the question is, how was Europe changed by the Protestant Reformation? So I want you to think about that, and I'll see you in class.